Welcome, everyone, to the first session of the Europe Center's Thursday seminar series in the winter quarter. Today, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Stefanie Walter to the Europe Center today. Professor Walter comes to us from the Institute of Political Science at the University of Zurich. She's an extremely well-regarded expert in international political economy and the political causes and consequences of economic crises, globalization, and international cooperation. She's the author of over 35 articles and the author or co-author of several books. She's also published extensively in the public sphere with explainers and blog posts on the Eurozone crisis, Brexit, and public opinion in Europe. And today, we're absolutely thrilled to have her here to present on when voters challenge international institutions, implications at home and abroad. And as usual, Professor Walter will present, and then we'll take Q&A until about 1 p.m. or so. So please join me in welcome.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Anna, and thank you so much for Christoph for inviting me. We've tried several times to schedule this talk. We had to reschedule because of COVID, so I'm really excited to be here now. Very happy. So what I'm presenting to you today is the result of a big project that I have, and it's more of an overview talk that tries to tie together the different things that I've been working on. And I'm thinking about turning this into a book. So I'm curious also to hear whether you think this all sort of somehow fits together. The motivation for this is that in the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in something that I call voter-endorsed challenges to international institutions. So these are processes in which one member state of an international institution attempts to unilaterally change the terms of or withdraw from an existing international agreement or an international organization on the basis of a strong popular mandate, right? So that could be a referendum. That's sort of the clearest popular mandate you could have, but it could also be a central campaign promise, right? So think of Donald Trump's promise to pull out of the Iran deal or the Paris Climate Agreement, right? So what I'm thinking of here are renegotiation bids, like the NAFTA renegotiation bid, for example, non-compliance with international agreements, and withdrawal threats that are based on referendum votes or key campaign promises. And the motivation is that what we can really see is that in the last decade, this has really increased, these voter-endorsed incidents. So here, what you can see on this slide is just focusing on referendums. So, there's one part of this, not the campaign promises, but just the referendums. And one of the things you can see here is that not only has the number of referendums been increasing over time, but in the last decade, the number of referendums that either focus on not cooperating anymore or not complying with the existing treaties or outright withdrawal has increased substantially. It's not like that has never happened before. I'll talk about some of these referendums, but really the incidence has really increased dramatically in the last decade. So what it means when voters really vote to challenge an international institution means that this issue becomes very politicized, both at home and abroad. Referendums really often galvanize public opinion on these issues. It gives the decision to challenge an international institution with a lot of democratic legitimacy because people voted to do this, right? But that also means that internationally it limits the room for compromise because it's of course the voters in the other countries didn't vote for this, but the other country can then say, well, but we're limited by this vote. It really is difficult for governments to then sort of say, well, we're not implementing this vote after all, although this also happened, right? And as I said, this incidence of such challenges has been increasing in recent years. So this is sort of where my project comes in. I have an ERC project called The Mass Politics of Disintegration, which studies how other countries respond to these kind of voter-endorsed challenges to international institutions. So what are the risks and trade-offs that the other member states and the international institutions as such face? And how do the other member states respond to these challenges, right? And also, how does the public then also respond in these countries? So in terms of theory, this starts from the argument that faced with such a challenge to an international institution, essentially you can conceptualize the possible response on a continuum that ranges from accommodation to non-accommodation, right? Accommodation means that you modify an international agreement along the lines demanded by the challenging state, you grant exception, you negotiate a new agreement in line with the withdrawing or challenging country's demands, right? So think of, for example, the NAFTA negotiations where Canada and Mexico kind of agreed to a new agreement which which kept many of the things in place, but gave the US a bigger share of the pie than NAFTA had done. Right? So that's an accommodating response. The alternative is non-accommodation. So you make no concessions, no exception. You try to make withdrawal or a challenge, whatever, like non-compliance and so on, costly for the leaving state. Right? Whatever the change that they're demanding, you make it costly. And here we have the example of Greece here, because the EU's response to the Greek referendum is sort of a prime example there. The Greeks had voted not to implement more austerity in the Greek bailout referendum, but still wanted to have a bailout, but not with the austerity attached. So the government, or the prime minister at the time, Alexis Tsipras, went to Brussels and said, look, my people have voted. You need to change the agreement. And the EU, the other EU member state basically said, or the Eurozone state said, yeah, but we don't want to do that. So you can either implement austerity or you can leave the euro. But those are the two choices, right? And in this case, the Greek government backed down and said, okay, we'll take the bailout with austerity in the end. In the end, what they implemented was very close to the agreement that had originally been proposed by the EU. And it's also something, just as a side note, that actually Greek voters wanted, like faced with really the choice of leaving the euro, that is something that they really did not want. Right? But that's a non-accommodating response. You kind of say, well, either you're in or out, but if you're out, you can also not have any of the benefits, right? So you need to choose. Okay, so these challenges to international institutions are difficult for the other member states because they have spillover effects abroad. They affect these other member states as well. And I'm looking at two main issues here that can affect these countries, and they are associated with some of these responses, right? So if the other member states choose a non-accommodating response, that means that the risk is that they can lose a lot of existing cooperation gains, right? Take the Greece example. If Greece had sort of left the Eurozone, that would have been very costly for Greece. It would have also been very costly for the Eurozone. It would have been a major price, right? So in general, one can say that, not accommodating member states, not accommodating these challenges and basically saying, well, if you don't want to cooperate, then we return to a less cooperating state, but we're not changing the rules of the game so that you can have a bigger share of the pie. That means that you reintroduce barriers to cooperation, and that tends to be costly. So, for example, you introduce trade barriers, transaction costs increase, you lose, shared information, and so on. Think of, cooperation, police cooperation, and so on. But the interesting thing is also exposure may vary across member states. Right? So Eurozone countries would have been affected by a Euro exit of Greece much more than non-Eurozone states, right? Then probably, some countries like Germany would have been less affected than other countries like Spain or Italy that were sort of more similar to Greece, where you could have expected that, markets would have really sort of lashed out at these countries as well. So exposure varies across. So that means non-accommodation is costly, but the problem is that accommodation is also costly, right? Because it carries the risk of political contagion effect. Accommodation basically means that a state challenges and you accommodate that challenge, which then result, in the rearrangement of the distribution of the cooperation gain in the challenging country's favor. So if you think of cooperation gains as a pie, it's distributed in a certain way, and the challenging state wants to have a bigger share of the pie, and you agree to that. Right? That's quite attractive, right? That's quite attractive to the leaving state, but it also doesn't go unnoticed in other countries and raises the question there, why don't we do the same thing, right? So that means that a successful challenge may encourage others to pursue a similar path, right? It creates an encouragement effect, and that can really threaten an institution's long-term stability, because in the end, international cooperation is premised on compromise, right? And then if every state only picks those things that they like and doesn't do those things anymore they don't like, then eventually the whole arrangement falls apart. So that has a couple of implications. So if we think about the loss of existing cooperation gain, we can expect that the more exposed the member state is to the losses of existing cooperation gain, the more costly non-accommodation is likely to be. Right? So that should also mean that the willingness to accommodate a state that challenges should increase with exposure. Right? When the costs are so high, then just like Canada and Mexico, that basically said, look, losing all of trade relations that NAFTA has is much worse than giving the US a better deal on these couple of issues, right? In the sort of big picture thing. For the risk of political contagion effects, we can expect that, or I argue, I guess, that the more successful a challenge is for the challenging state, the higher the likelihood that actors in other member states will push for similar challenges and vice versa, right? So we can expect encouragement and deterrence effect. The better sort of the challenge is going, the more accommodated a challenging country is, the more other countries should want to do the same. But the worse the challenging experience is, right, the more other countries should be deterred from trying to do the same. Okay, so that then in the end creates a dilemma for the other member states, right? Because that arises from the fact that both accommodation and non-accommodation have advantages and disadvantages, but none of them is cost-free, right? So the advantage of accommodation is that it preserves some cooperation gains, but the downside is that it leaves the remaining member states worse off, and it can create contagion risks, right? Now, the advantage of non-accommodation is that it increases the likelihood that the challenging state avoids this disintegration bit. So think of Greece that in the end said, okay, we'll just go along with the status quo, right? And it reduces contagion risk because you show that, you create a precedent case that's not very attractive. But the problem is, of course, that this can be very costly for everyone. It's also, it's very risky if you can really cause deteriorating relations, right? So if Greece had really left the Eurozone, that would have been very costly for the other member states as well. So the accommodation dilemma means that non-accommodation is costly, but accommodation may encourage further disintegration, and the other member states need to balance, or the other countries need to balance these two costs, and they face this dilemma. It's always kind of difficult. So we can think of this as a 2x2, very simple in terms of sort of ideal type situation. When contagion risks are I should have done this the other way around. When cooperation gains at risk are low, but contagion risks are high, that's when we can really expect non-accommodation. When contagion risks are low, but the cooperation gains at risk are really high, think of the NAFTA case, that's when we can expect accommodation. Okay? And then when both kind of risks are high, that's when states really face the dilemma. And then, when both risks are low, then the response is a bit unclear, right? But it's also not such a high profile situation, right? It's low cost associated with either strategy. Okay. So that's sort of the basic framework, essentially, or the core of my project. And we've been working on this for almost 3 years now, on sort of looking at several parts of this whole argument. And I'll present to you some evidence. So the first one is on the accommodation dilemma and member states' responses to voter-endorsed challenges to international institutions, and really sort of the broader comparative aspect of this. And I'll show you very briefly only, and we can talk about this in more detail in the Q&A if you want, the results of a comparative case study of the 7 referendum-induced challenges that have been successful, where voters really voted in favor of challenging, right? You saw before that there have been more referendums aimed at sort of, for example, withdrawing. For example, in 1986, Spain voted on leaving NATO, right? This was after the democratic transition. They basically had to reaffirm their membership, but the way it was framed as getting out of NATO, and they just overwhelmingly said, no, we want to stay. So I'm not so interested in those cases. I'm interested in the cases where countries vote to challenge, like the Brexit referendum, for example. And then I'll move on to show you a host of studies. I'll just show you sort of bits and pieces. And then if you're interested, you can go into more detail in each of these studies on the micro level evidence that we have on the mechanism about the accommodation dilemma. First, I'll show you that sort of this idea about contagion effect is really there, both in terms of deterrence and encouragement, looking mostly at the Brexit case because it's a really good case to study this. And then I'll show you some individual level on the accommodation dilemma that, on the individual level, respondents also grasp this dilemma and are faced with this dilemma. Okay, so I'll start with the accommodation dilemma and member state response. So what we have here is a list of these 7 referendums where voters really supported a challenge to an international institution, either in terms of renegotiation of the membership terms or a withdrawal from the institution. And I'm focusing on referendums here because they're really the most extreme form of voter endorsement. In elections, elections are always multidimensional. There's many issues, but the referendum is really a single issue thing. People really vote on this, and we know that voters really wanted to challenge the institution. So there's 7 that have been successful. They cover a variety of issues, but the interesting thing is they cluster in certain issues. One is membership in the European community and later the EU. So that's Greenland in 1982 and the UK in 2016. Then we have a couple on debt repayment and austerity. Brazil in 2000, Iceland in 2010, and then again in 2011, and Greece in 2015. And then one on migration. That's in Switzerland in 2050. Right? One of the things that I'm trying to do, these are, as you can see, these are quite different issues, right? But what I'm trying to do is to measure the risk of contagion risk and the level of corporation gains at risk across these cases. So trying to develop like an idea on how we can, across these different issues, measure this. So the corporation gains at risk, the way I did that, I thought about what is the potential worst case consequence for the international institution if, there's non-accommodation and sort of this really goes through. So think, in the Greek case, exit from the Eurozone. In the Iceland cases, none of the money is being repaid. In the Brexit case, it would be a no-deal Brexit and so on. Right? So I'm looking at 3 dimensions here. The size of the potential losses, the breadth of the potential losses. Is it just like one issue or is it rather broad, like affecting many issue areas? And is it a one-off cost or a long-term and repeated loss? Right? So for example, I'll show you in a second, but Iceland, for example, was about a repayment of certain money that they owed to the UK and the Netherlands. So that was, it was a one-off thing, right? After that, it would have been, but then Brexit, for example, it covers many things and also, of course, goes on across several years and so on. And the idea is that bigger, broader, and more long-term losses denote higher corporation gains at risk for the remaining member states. And then for contagion risk, I'm identifying 2 dimensions. One is how attractive an accommodative solution is to others, right? And then second is how unique is the case? How easy would it be to transfer the results of this case? Like how easy would it be for other countries to say, I want the same model, right? And here the idea is that more attractive and less unique cases denote higher levels of contagion risk. Right? So this is sort of, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the paper goes into this quite some detail, how I classified these things. These are the corporation gains at risk. And what you can see just on the last column is that overall, there's quite some variation from cases where the corporation gains at risk are really very high, like in the Brexit referendum, to some cases where it's really relatively low, like in the ICE-safe referendum. Right? The same here for contagion risk. We again see quite some variation from rather low levels of contagion risk, like when Greenland left the European communities in 1982. Greenland had been a Danish colony, and as part of Denmark, they entered the EC. Denmark had a referendum that Greenlanders had also voted on that. They had voted against becoming a part of the European community, but nonetheless had to enter because they were part of Greenland as this colony. And when they became independent, they said, look, we never wanted to be part of this in the first place. We want to get out. So that's a very unique case. There's no other colonies at this point than anymore in Europe. And you can sort of say, it's transferring this to another case would be relatively low. Mind you, Italy, if you go into sort of the sources, Italy was worried that Sardinia might ask for similar things if Greenland did this. So, there were sort of contagion risk was still in people's mind. But overall, compared to some of these other referendums, contagion risks were very low. That's different in the Swiss immigration referendum, for example. Switzerland wanted to limit free movement of people. That's a quite contentious issue in the EU, right? And they wanted to basically be able to sort of pick and choose a little bit the immigration rules and who they can leave out and who they can get in, wanted to have quotas. That would have been attractive to many other EU countries as well, right? So here, the contagion risk is very high. So if we put this together, and as I said, I'm just giving you sort of a glimpse on these different things, and you can go into detail into different papers. But if we put all of this together, we see that there's really a lot of variation in these cases. And when we look at the outcome of what happened in these cases, we also see that they more or less sort of correspond with expectation. So Switzerland and Greece were really not accommodated, and they're really also up there in this dilemma, like the sort of the upper, right-hand corner. That's the that's the accommodation dilemma corner, right, where the contagion risk is really high. We see that the UK, where the corporation gains at risk were extremely high. There was some accommodation, but overall it was also relatively non-accommodating. But other than that, here actually the interesting thing is that non-accommodation dominates. Brazil in 2000 is interesting because it basically the other countries didn't have to respond. It was not a binding referendum, and the government immediately said, we're not going to implement it. And my argument suggests, however, that it was very clear that the other countries would not accommodate it. Right? It was a referendum on not repaying an IMF loan. And then we have Iceland 1 and 2 here, where first they accommodated a little bit, but then the Icelanders said, well, we don't want the whole thing. We don't want this little bit. Then they rejected it again. And then the other country said, no, but we're not happy with this. And then this is an interesting case because they were able to take this to the EFTA court. And the EFTA court then ruled in favor of Iceland. So it's in a way a case of like failed non-accommodation. And then down there we have Greenland, which is the case as we just discussed where contagion risks were really low. The corporation gains at risk were not, they were sort of medium. I mean, it was relatively broad, but it's also Greenland is relatively small, right? And much of it was concentrated on fisheries. So they actually got a pretty good deal. They have pretty close relations now with the EU, but they also have their own. Right? So overall, what you can see that the basic message here is that even though these referendums are so different, the accommodation dilemma framework provides a rather parsimonious, but in a way powerful framework to explain these different responses to these challenges, or this very diverse set of referendum challenges. Right? We can see that both the potential loss of existing corporation gains and the contagion risks influence responses, and the politics of these disintegration bids become particularly difficult when both spillover effects are large, right, in this accommodation dilemma cases. And here what this suggests is that then the contagion dynamic is really very important there, right, and drives response. Okay, so that's sort of for the big picture, and now we're going to go into like the micro picture. I'm going to show you that contagion effects really exist, and I'm going to look at the case of Brexit, and I'll show you that these Brexit-related contagion effects exist among the mass public in other EU 27 member states. Also in the discourse of Eurosceptic populist parties in Europe, and also in countries that are not part of the EU but have close relations with the EU and upcoming referendums similar to the ones like Brexit, and in this case, that's Switzerland, my own country. Right? And then I'm going to show that the accommodation dilemma also shows individual level preferences on how to respond to voter-endorsed challenges. So if you ask people in the other member states how they should respond to a challenge, you can see the accommodation dilemma at work as well. All right, so we'll start with Brexit, right? And one of the main concerns when Brexit happened was exactly this, that this would be a precursor to like a big collapse of the EU, that other countries would just do the same and follow, and this would really threaten the stability of the EU as a whole. And this, I think, why that's also important really to understand whether that happened. And we know that now that it did not happen, why it did not happen. Okay, so I've run a couple of studies, and I'll show you. For this, I'm going to show you mostly descriptives, just because for a talk like that, I think they're easier to say. But let me just say there's also more causative stuff behind it in the papers, right? So what I did here is I ran 6 survey waves during the Brexit negotiation phase, the withdrawal negotiation, from July 2017 until December 2019, where I asked in each wave about 10,000 EU 27 working age European, what they thought about Brexit, what they thought about the EU, what they thought about how the EU should respond to Brexit, and so on. Right? And what you can see here is that here's the British pound exchange rate, which can be seen as a proxy to how well the Brexit process was going, and goes quite a lot up and down. Initially, it wasn't going so badly for the UK, but then maybe you remember this in late 2018, it became really difficult with trying to get the withdrawal agreement done, right? It was supposed to pass in Parliament, then it didn't, and they tried again and it didn't. And then we talked about this before because they had triggered this Article 50, which basically sets in motion a 2-year process by which the country can leave. It was clear that the UK needs to find a solution. Oh no. Oh God, I got this thing. I'm sorry. You told me not to touch it. I'm sorry. But I just touched here. Maybe we need to. Yeah. I'm so sorry. Maybe I'll just tell you about this while we try to fix this, and then. What was I saying? Yeah. So I mean, excellent. So, anyways, the UK was almost crashing out of the EU because they had to leave, and there was no solution in sight, right? And then there was like a 2-week. Then the EU at some point said, "Okay, we're going to extend this period by 2 weeks." It was complete chaos. We didn't really know what was going to happen. I was designing a survey for this, and I actually had 3 questionnaires because I had no idea whether they were going to say we're going to crash out, we're going to have an extension, or we're going to withdraw the withdrawal bid. Right? In the end, it was an extension, but you can see here how the exchange rate really in that period tanked, and really and then it got worse and worse and worse, and then Theresa May had to leave office. Boris Johnson comes in. It's still very difficult. Finally, they find a deal and so on. And then, by the end of 2019, they finally have a deal to leave the EU. But so we can see a lot of ups and downs. And what we can see is that some of these ups and downs we can also see in public opinion. The second panel looks at whether people think that Brexit will be a good thing for the UK in 5 years in the medium term. And here you can see that over time, people become much more pessimistic, right? They start out with a good chunk of people saying, yeah, this will be good for the UK, and less people think that. And you see it even more so, and especially you can see sort of the effects of this Brexit chaos in spring 2019 with the question on whether people would support an exit of their own country from the EU, right? And there we can see that in the first couple of years, it remains at a, for the EU, rather uncomfortable high level, about 25%. But then, it really tanks in spring 2019. Then it recovers, but never goes back up to the levels that they had at the beginning of the Brexit negotiation. So what this shows is that contagion effects depend on how well Brexit is going. The more difficult it is, the lower the support for EU exit becomes in the other member states. And this is not in this graph here, but in the paper, positive evaluations of Brexit are associated with higher support for EU exit and vice versa. Okay, so we can also do this in a more causally identified way. We've done this here with an unexpected event during survey design, where we pick specific episodes of the Brexit process. For example, the delay on voting on the exit deal, or the first rejection then on the Brexit deal, but also positive ones, such as the election of Boris Johnson, which was a big success for Boris Johnson, right? So which you could say is from a Eurosceptic perspective was a success, right? Whereas these are negative events. And here what we can see is that Brexit difficulties are widely reported in the other member states. This was something that was not going on in detail, but it was quite out in the open. We also see here that such difficulties increase respondent support for European integration. So we see a clear deterrence effect. And we see that positive Brexit events, in this case, the Johnson election victory, makes respondents less likely to say that the EU is going in the right direction. So that then increases skepticism again. So we also see this encouragement effect, right? So it can go in both ways, right? And overall, we've seen a deterrence effect so far. But I think this is related to the fact that Brexit really didn't go very well for the UK so far. Had it gone differently, these results suggest it might have well gone in the other direction with much more encouragement. And here's some very sort of descriptive evidence for this, also from this one of these surveys, because I also asked people to rank from these 5 possible goals what they thought was the most important goal, what they thought should be the most important goal in the Brexit negotiation. So maintaining my country's trade relations with the UK, avoiding that other countries leave the EU in the future, that is the contagion concern, right? Establishing a standard procedure that makes it easier for countries to leave the EU in the future, right? That's setting a precedent that encourages that makes it easier for other countries to leave, avoid a failure of the Brexit negotiations, or punish the UK for leaving the EU. And the interesting thing is that for Eurosceptics, that's the last column, more than half of them say the most important thing about the Brexit negotiation is to create a precedent that makes it easier for other countries to leave. That's what they really, for them, they really saw this as a chance. So again, this shows the potential for contagion was really there, right? Whereas for Europhiles, the most important issue is exactly the opposite, avoiding that other countries leave the EU. And for sort of overall, if you look all of them, they are sort of the regular, normal. If they're not particularly fond of the EU or particularly opposed, most of them then care about maintaining trade. Right? Trade is much less contentious in Europe than it is in the US. All right. And we can also see this when we look at nationalist party discourse in the EU. What we've quoted here is statements by Eurosceptic partisans in the national media in I think 7 European EU 27 member states, so not the UK, but the other countries. And we've quoted sort of how they talk about the EU, whether they sort of accept the status quo, what the EU is doing right now, whether they say their country should only remain, like the EU should be reformed, whether they say the EU should be reformed, and if it does not, their country should be leaving the EU. So it's this sort of the aggressiveness is increasing, right? And then on the top, you see really outright demands to leave. And sort of the peak of demands to leave really is around the Brexit referendum. You had a lot of partisan leaders, Marine Le Pen and so on, saying, "Oh, now maintenant la France. Yeah? Now France should also be leaving." But then, as the negotiations are not going so well, this really goes down, and they become much more conciliatory. They don't talk about EU exit all this much anymore. They talk much more about EU reform. This does not mean that they become more Europhile. They still think the EU is not good, and it's also doesn't necessarily say that that's so easy to deal with for the EU, because they come to say, exit is not. So it's rather than exit, we're going to do voice, right? We're going to really ask for reform. But nonetheless, we see that during the negotiations, there's a real clear deterrence effect. And then for this paper, we stopped collecting data because we then went into the review process in early 2020. Early 22. Yeah, so I thought it was. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, but this so it goes up. I'm a bit surprised because I need to go back. We had some discussion, my postdoc and I thought it was earlier. Sorry, but anyways, this is the time when the UK rolls out the vaccination campaign very successfully and earlier than the rest of Europeans, and says this is just because of Brexit. So then you see it picking up again, right? That other parties start talking about exit again. All right. So finally, what's going on beyond the EU? Because Switzerland is having kind of difficult relations with the EU right now as well. And for the Swiss, the UK was really insightful, or at least they thought that they could learn a lot from the UK, right? And they thought that also the government thought that the UK would negotiate a great deal and then they could just tag on, right? Again, highlighting the risk of contagion effect. So Brexit is watched very closely in Switzerland, and always a lot of it comments on sort of what does it mean for us, right? So what does the Brexit treaty mean for Switzerland, for example, here? Or here it says, the Brexit deal makes the Swiss jealous. They want the same thing. And you can also ask, when you ask the Swiss whether they think that the UK's negotiation strategy, whether that's an example to follow, a role model, or a deterring example, you see that even though most people think it's more of a deterring example, quite a lot of them think that it's a role model. And especially sort of in February 21, just when the UK is starting to roll out the vaccine, suddenly, again, sort of there's an uptick and people think it's really a role model also for Switzerland. What we can also see is that the more positively Swiss respondents view Brexit, the more they expect the EU to ultimately accommodate Swiss demand. So Switzerland had a couple of referendums and also ongoing negotiations at the time. The limitation initiative was a referendum that aimed at terminating the Swiss EU freedom of movement treaty, or renegotiating it in Switzerland's favor. And so the EU always said, if you do that, then all of the bilateral treaties fall away. They're tied together with something called the guillotine clause. So the question is, would the EU actually do that, right? And And the other thing is what that was going on at the same time as Switzerland was negotiating an institutional framework agreement on closer integration with the EU. Right? That was all going on at the same time. So that allows us to study the effects of Brexit on these really very real questions in Switzerland. And I can't go into detail here, but what we find is the more positively Swiss respondents view Brexit, the more they expect the EU to ultimately accommodate Swiss demand. Right? And because we have panel data, we can also really look at sort of changes in views of Brexit and how they relate to changes in expectations and so on. And you can really see that there is a clear correlation there. There's also again, more causal evidence. So we talked about the Brexit chaos in early 2019. I ran a survey just before the negotiations, and then I stopped for 2 weeks. I thought I'd do the second part right after. But then, as we said, there was 2 weeks where nobody really knew what was going to happen. So we waited. And then once they had decided on how to move on, in this case, they prolonged the period. I ran sort of a second wave, and I asked people on their vote intentions on 3 actual upcoming referendums on Swiss-EU relations and 1 hypothetical one that's terminating the bilateral treaties overall. One was the weapon law reform. Doesn't sound like it has anything to do with the EU, but that reform became necessary because there were some changes to the Schengen rules, and it was challenged. Had Switzerland voted no, they would have dropped out of Schengen within 3 months. So that's quite a thing. Then the limitation initiative on free movement of people, and then the framework agreement. Would they vote in favor of this? And I've quoted this always here in a way that sort of higher values are like not like Eurosceptic view, basically, right? And what we can see is that just within these 2 weeks, not much happened in Switzerland in these 2 weeks. Everybody was fixated on what was going on in the UK. We got a lot of coverage in Swiss press. The support for sort of Eurosceptic positions in all of these upcoming referendums significantly went down, right? So we see that really, I mean, there are these contagion effects. People look to what's going on in other countries to decide then on their own policies towards the EU. Okay, so now we've talked a lot about sort of these contagion effects exist. And in the last bit, I want to talk about individual level evidence on the accommodation dilemma, right? So we've seen that the accommodation dilemma shapes member state responses in these referendums, but do regular people also understand this dilemma, right? And does it exist? And this is kind of like here we see, the corporation gains. This is something called the Brexit monster, which the Dutch government invented. They have a big brochure and they have thousands of pictures of the Brexit monster always obstructing trade in this case, sometimes it's lying and creating big red tape. Have you seen this, the Brexit monster? Yeah. So it's, yeah. And then, of course, here the card. Yeah. But it's kind of like, it symbolizes sort of the corporation gains that can be lost. And of course, then here we have this concern about contagion risk. So on the individual level, what we can see, I'm using again the data that you saw before with the 6 waves during the Brexit negotiations. What we can see here is that on a country level, contagion concern and exposure to the effects of Brexit really matter. So here, as an indicator for how much people are worried about contagion, I use how much they like the EU, how positively they view the EU, assuming that the more positively you view the EU, the more worried you are to challenges about it, right? And what you can really see here, just like, and then in the paper, I will look at this in a more refined way, but people who are more positive about the EU think that the EU should be much harder on the UK in the negotiation. Whereas those who don't like the EU think, one should accommodate the UK much more, right? There's a less clear but still negative effect for exposure. Those who are more exposed tend to be more willing to accommodate the EU, whereas those who are less exposed take a harder line. And the interesting thing is I then look at this at the individual level, and I know where people live. And there's data that predicts how much a region's GDP would be hit by a hard Brexit, right? So that's a good measure for the exposure of that specific region. That varies widely. Ireland is really high. They are on top. Also, south of Germany and Netherlands are really high up there. But for example, Bulgaria, Romania, Spain, or Malta, there's very little trade with the UK compared to these countries. So we have a lot of variation. And what we can see here is that again, we can see that people who like the EU are much harder, but this effect really gets moderated when people live in regions that are highly exposed. So that's sort of evidence for the accommodation dilemma, right? If they're exposed, they like the EU, but they also know that non-accommodation might be really costly, then they become more accommodating, right? So we see this moderating effect. We also see this when we look at more issues. This is a conjoined experiment that looks at different issues in the Brexit negotiations and looks at sort of zero-sum issues where it's really, if it's worse for the UK, it's better for the EU. Prime example is the Brexit bill. The more the UK pays, the better it is for the EU. And then cooperation issues where when it's bad for the UK, it's also bad for the EU. Think of trade or cooperation in research programs and so on, right? And what we can see here is that in general, the Eurosceptics are much more accommodating than the Europhiles again. But also that on sort of these cooperation issues, even Europhiles are much more accommodating than on the zero-sum issues, right? Because there the costs of non-accommodation are much higher. All right, so this is sort of where we stand right now. And what I'm thinking of right now is expanding the scope of the argument, because I think the accommodation dilemma is likely to apply in other situations in which one country is behaving non-cooperatively as well. So first of all, these kind of challenges to international organizations that don't come from voters but come from elite, right? That's sort of the clearest or the closest challenge. But also getting reluctant countries to participate in international institutions and treaties and agreements in the first place, responding to non-compliance, also economic sanctions, right? If you think about sort of Russia and the sanctions, the problem is essentially the same. You have, on the one hand, the cost of accommodation, like just allowing Russia to go on and not sort of stepping in, carries the risk that they will do it again and again and again, which kind of happens when they, annexed Crimea. There was not a very strong response. And so then you have these reputation and contagion risks. But on the other hand, not accommodating, so imposing the sanctions, it's really expensive, right? Living in Europe and, we have all these plans about when the heating will be turned off. I mean, that's costly also to voters. So, I'm thinking about how to apply it in these cases as well. So the goal is really to think more broadly about the scope conditions of the argument and the context conditions under which things we talked about, like bargaining power and so on before. So there is some preliminary evidence that I have for this broader scope. I did a survey in Finland and Sweden on how to respond to Russian aggression in Ukraine. So that's the sanction, but also how to respond to Turkey, which is blocking Swedish and Finnish NATO accession, right? And again, what you can see here is that people are more concerned about security because, they want, for example, more defense spending. They're much, much more in favor of increasing sanctions. This data is from October and November of last year. And I asked them sort of, maintain sanctions or lift some of the sanctions or increase them. And they say even, increase them significantly more. Those who say they're worried, they're not satisfied with how well the economy is doing, they're much more accommodating. That really sort of makes them more willing to lower sanctions. The same for Turkey. You may know that in sort of the bone of contention in Turkey's blocking of Sweden and Finland is sort of they want the extradition of what they say is Turkish terrorists, but some of these people have asylum and so in these Nordic countries. So it's very much an issue of minority rights. So it's really the issue is the reputation of these countries for minority rights. But also this question, can you be blackmailed and so on, right? But here what you can see is that people who care about minority rights are much less willing to comply with Turkish demand, whereas people who really support NATO accession, and they are more willing to say, yeah, we need to compromise with Turkey, right? So again, we see these accommodation dilemmas here as well. And then I have also some experimental data that I'm leaving out here, but both of these analyses indicate that the accommodation dilemma is at play here as well. Okay, so to conclude, voter-endorsed disintegration bids confront the affected institutions, other member states with an accommodation dilemma. Non-accommodation is costly, but accommodation may be destabilizing in the long run through contagion effect. And we can use the accommodation dilemma to explain very different types of challenges, right? So evidence for the mechanism shows that both voters and governments care about both of these aspects, contagion risk and cooperation gain. And the relative size of cooperation gains versus the size of the contagion risk influences the preferred member state response. And that's it. Thank you very much.
So we'll now open it up to Q&A.
Thank you so much for this presentation. My name's Naomi Eagle. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC, and my question follows very directly from your conclusion. So this is great. I think the project is fascinating, and one thing that stood out to me is that in the examples you gave, the choice or the referendum is essentially stop cooperating or not. But it's not sort of shifting towards cooperation through a different institution or with different actors in sort of a forum shopping sense. And so in thinking about scope conditions, I'm wondering whether the accommodation dilemma applies or whether it applies in the same way, if there's an alternative institution or form of cooperation to choose instead. And maybe this applies less in the context of the EU, but maybe if we're thinking about global institutions, that may be more relevant.
Do you want me to answer right away, or are you like? Okay, yeah, I think it's still okay, good. Yeah, that's an excellent question. These are exactly the kind of questions that I'm sort of grappling with right now. I think when there are alternative institutions that allow countries to maintain cooperation, that makes things in a way easier. They can also build of it. Think about, the US has been blocking the WTO's appellate body, right? Because they need to have judges, they need to be appointed, and everybody needs to appoint them unanimously. Yeah, and the U.S. has started under Trump say, well, we're just not agreeing, but Biden has continued that policy, right? So basically, the dispute settlement system of the WTO is dying because the appellate body doesn't function anymore. Now, the EU and some other countries have now set up a sort of copy of that process. They've basically said, well, we agree to create sort of the same process, an appellate body outside the WTO, because and without the US, but all the countries that sign on to this can basically agree to, when there is a dispute, to use that sort of copy appellate body. So that, of course, then reduces a little bit the non-cooperation risk, although it's not perfect, right? And I think the interesting question is, does this then mean that the contagion risk get more weight, or does it just sort of reduce sort of the problem overall, and they just find other ways? And I think that, again, also has to do with bargaining power, right? So if it were another country, not the US, I think the response would likely have been different. You would have tried to bully that, or like pressure that country, I guess, into, agreeing. But with the US, it's difficult to do. But I think that's a very good question. I need to think more in exactly these ways. Yeah.
Name Prabodh Jamwal. I am a fellow here. I just want to know whether Brexit, or in that case, the countries which want to go out of the Union, does it threaten the integrity of that member state? How far it is true that the population is divided, and it may crop up the question whether to leave or stay in future.
So you're talking about the other member states, right? So both. I mean, in the leaving member state, I think what Brexit shows, but also what the Swiss case shows, which has had its share of things, it can be very divisive. There will always be some who just think we should just follow through with it, no matter the cost, right? And in the British case, I think we see how divisive the whole problem is. I think in the British case, that's compounded by the fact that they didn't vote for a proposal, but just against something. And everybody's like, we've had a big business. That the EU's bad. That was one thing that they could agree on, but not on where to go. And I think that contributed to the problems in the UK. In the other countries, I think that what we saw with Brexit and sort of the vehemence with which many Eurosceptic policy makers really stepped up their demands for leaving, also like including Eurosceptic parties that had not really championed this before. So in Germany, for example, Eurosceptic had never really that that would be very. And my understanding that with all the research that I've done is that out really sparked a lot of demand in other countries.
Thank you. My name is Luis Rodriguez. I'm also a postdoctoral fellow at CSAC. I'm also, as Naomi, thinking about how to extend this theory to other cases. And I wonder if an intervening variable could also be the long-term consequences of getting out of this kind of agreements. And I'm thinking CSAC, security, and nuclear. I'm thinking specifically about the consequences of North Korea getting out of the NPT, for example, and how back then a lot of people thought it was going to create a contagion or a domino effect. And maybe the long-term consequences of getting out is what is deterring other countries from doing the same. So more than just paying attention to the immediate effects of getting out, maybe the contagion is not happening because of the long-term effects of this. Thanks for your presentation.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think conceptually, I think we can subsume it under the contagion risk. The question is, like, is it what matters more, the short-term contagion or the long-term contagion? Perhaps both, right? And sort of looking at it. And I mean, I still think that sort of should the UK, go on this sort of explosion of productivity, GDP growth, and suddenly, I mean, I think we would still see this again, much more demand. Right. What? That world, that was already about. So this is exactly what I'm trying about now. Like this has been sort of more economic, IO kind of thing, but really branching out more to security. And so because I think many of the dynamics are similar there as well. Yeah, that's actually, I'm grateful for this example. It gives me more things to think about.
Yes, my prerogative. And I was wondering, to what extent do these have to be voter-endorsed disintegration bids, right? Because all the contagion effects and the cost of cooperation that you talk about really operate on the state level. And so it doesn't really matter how the disintegration bid comes about. They can certainly have consequences for the voters who perceive them and who note them. But unless we have some evidence of those feeding directly into subsequent referenda, it's not clear why these have to be voter-endorsed disintegration bid, which could basically hugely broaden your scope conditions, or I think ask you to provide us some evidence that this actually matters, given how sort of lumpy the distribution of these referenda are and how they don't seem to be on the same sets of issues.
Yeah, that's a very good comment. I mean, that's one thing that I've been grappling with. I started out with this because I got so interested in these referendums, and that's why I focus so much on the voter endorsement. But I agree that many of it. I mean, I think what makes the voter endorsed instances special is that the contagion risks are particularly pronounced because they're so prominent, right? Especially among voters, because these referendums get a lot of coverage also elsewhere and so on, right? So they're more visible than when one country doesn't comply with certain rules or tries, like the NAFTA negotiations were in other countries probably less politicized. I mean, the US is also a big case, right? So I'm actually with you. I think that it's broader than that, and it's something that I need to sort of reconcile. Also, if I want to do a book, do I want to do this just on that? It's smaller, but the case study is on referendums because they're sort of such nice, clear-cut cases. Because then, I actually think it applies broader, but then you really need to think about where is the boundary, what are the scope conditions, and that makes it harder. So it's something I'm grappling with.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. One was actually related to what Anna just asked. If you just focus on the EU and the relationship with the UK, there was a lot of accommodation already before the referendum actually took place. And while the UK was in the EU, they had a lot of special arrangements. They wanted even more. So a lot of these dynamics were going on at that time also. So what actually changed with the referendum? Of course, then they had decided to leave, but how did that change the dynamics? And in a way, you could say we were talking about the WTO, that dynamics before the referendum were maybe a bit similar to what's happening in the WTO. It's a country that doesn't want to appoint judges anymore, and then there's some institutions set up where that country does not participate in and stuff like that. So anyway, I had a sort of a vague question about that, and it sort of relates to what Anna was saying. So maybe you could say something about that. I had a couple other questions. I'll just ask one general question. So when you look at the Brexit case and how the EU, how the Commission and other players in the EU handled this from this perspective, do you think they did a good job in the end? If you look back at this whole episode, do you think that you did a reasonably good job at defining it?
So on to the accommodation pre-referendum, yeah, I think it's like some accommodation occurred there, but there was also limit, right? I mean, I think Cameron had hoped that he would get many more concessions, so that a referendum would not become necessary. But I think the kinds of concessions that he wanted would have again sort of really raised sort of demands in other countries to want the same. So I think I think it's a contagion concern that sort of limited the room for compromise that the EU Commission or the EU had. And I think they went as far as they could, up to the point when they thought, now then this really leads to too many things before. But I think another reason why they accommodated it, and why I think you're right to point out the similarity to the WTO case, is pre-referendum, the UK was still a member state, right? So they had a lot of veto power. They could hold up all of these decisions. This is why, we talked about this briefly before, that from a domestic politics standpoint, it's very, very clear why they triggered Article 50. From an international negotiation standpoint, it was, completely counterproductive. It took away all their bargaining power, right? Because they could have stayed in and said, like the Hungarians are doing, well, we're not voting in favor of this, we're not voting in favor of that. They would have had much more power to extract concession. But then also there's also some sociological research that says then sort of these identity dynamics start to kick in, that it's like an insider-outsider dynamic and so on. But I think you can also explain it very, very much from a rational choice, bargaining power perspective, why it makes a big difference on whether you have a veto or you don't, essentially. Then did the EU do a good job? I think one of these the things that characterize these positions when one country starts challenging is it's always bad for the other country, right? It's not a good. There's no, once the Brits voted on leaving, there was no good outcome for the UK for the EU. Because whatever it would do, there's always costs, right? So given that, I actually think they did quite well. And there was lots of concern how they would manage this, and there was lots of surprise that they were so unified, right? But I actually think exactly this sort of the contagion risk was a very unifying thing, because the Brexiteers kept saying, "But the German car makers, they will come and they will force the EU to give us concession." And there's statements from German car makers that say, yeah, the UK market is really important for us, but the single market is so much more important. And if that falls apart, then we really have a problem. So we'd rather the EU Commission be really tough on the UK, but safeguard the single market, right? And I think so the contagion concerns really help create a common interest in all of the EU member states, despite sort of their varying exposure to the corporation gains. And that, I think, helped the EU come together. And then I think they also rather skillfully had crafted the whole process. An interesting anecdote is that, I think many things in the whole process is just very puzzling for me from how the British did it, right? Because they usually have a very effective foreign service and so on. But apparently they were also not really prepared on what to do in the case of a yes vote, right? Whereas the EU had been thinking about this a lot. So they basically had in a drawer their sort of emergency plan. And that's why they also were they set the agenda and they sequenced the negotiations in a way that was very beneficial to them and not to the UK, in a way that allowed them, focusing sort of first on the zero-sum issues, allowed them to also sort of, put off the divisions that could potentially happen with between the member states. And once they had shown that that's actually quite a successful approach to do this very unified approach, then I think the others also came on board for the wider issue. So I think given that, the EU only had stuff to lose, I think they did quite well. But it's still, I think that there would be a much better outcome if the EU and the UK were cooperating much more closely. But you need the UK to, willing to make some concessions here as well. And if they don't, then I think this outcome is better than others.
Yeah, that slightly optimistic note, we've run out of time, especially for our Zoom audience.